Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Steve McGuire. I'm the director of the Matthew J. Ryan Center here at Villanova. The Ryan Center promotes inquiry into the principles of a free society, and tonight's event is on the future of conservatism. The event tonight is co-sponsored by the American Conservative, and so before we begin, I'd like to invite Emil Doak, the executive director of the American Conservative, to come up and just say a couple of words.
All right. Over here. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Steve. Thank all of you for joining us here this evening. We at the American Conservative are thrilled to be part of this because I think this question of the future of conservatism is really at the heart of our mission, the heart of our work, and in a large way, it's why we exist. Our magazine was founded back in 2002, and at that time, the future of the right was similarly in question. Our founding editors, Scott McConnell and Pat Buchanan, wanted to reignite a lot of conversations that they felt conservatives had ignored since at least the end of the Cold War, if not longer. We were against the Iraq War at that time, but we were also taking heterodox views on a number of other positions like political economy, immigration, and the place of faith and culture in our political life. So right now, in 2022, a lot of those issues are as live as they ever have been, and our magazine exists to chart a path forward for the right in this moment and beyond. So we publish a print magazine, we host conferences and debates like you're attending here tonight. We have a number of other programs and podcasts as well that I hope all of you will check out. We have copies of our latest print magazine and also a more recent issue in the lobby. Please do take one of those home with you and continue to follow our work at theamericanconservative.com. So anyways, thank you all of you for joining us tonight. We have an excellent panel lined up. Thank you to the Ryan Center as well. And I'm going to hand things back over to Steve.
Okay, thanks, Emil, and thanks to the American Conservative again for co-sponsoring this event. Thanks again to all of you for being here, to our panelists for agreeing to join us this evening. And I'd also like to shout out Jordan Watts, the Assistant Director of the Ryan Center, who's basically done everything to make this evening possible. Also, this event is being live streamed, so I'd like to say thanks to all of those who are watching at home. So in terms of this evening's discussion, each of our panelists will start by offering some brief introductory remarks, and then we'll offer them an opportunity to respond to one another, after which we'll open things up to Q&A from the audience. Tonight's speakers, immediately to my right is Sohrab Ahmari. He's contributing editor at the American Conservative and a visiting fellow of the Veritas Center for Ethics in Public Life at Franciscan University. His books include From Fire by Water, My Journey to the Catholic Faith, and The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. And you're currently working on a new book, isn't that right, Sohrab? And what's the topic of that book?
It's about private tyranny.
Okay, privatized tyranny, good. Next is Timothy P. Carney. He's senior political columnist at the Washington Examiner and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on economic competition, cronyism, civil society localism, and religion in America. He's the author of The Big Ripoff, How Big Business and Big Government Steal Your Money, Obamonomics, How Barack Obama is Bankrupting You and Enriching His Wall Street Friends, and then Alienated America. This is his most recent book, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. And then last but not least, we have Dr. William B. Allen, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Michigan State University. He was also a senior fellow of the Ryan Center here at Villanova a couple of years ago. His many publications include George Washington, A Collection, Rethinking Uncle Tom, The Political Philosophy of H.B. Stowe, and Habits of Mind, Fostering Access and Excellence in Higher Education. And I believe he also has, in about a year, a new translation and commentary on Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws forthcoming. Okay, so tonight is, the topic of our conversation is the future of conservatism. For opening statements, we'll proceed in the order that the panelists appear on the poster, so we'll start with Tim.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I know there's other things Villanova-y going on tonight, so I appreciate that. I appreciate your leaving My alma mater on my bio, I went to St. John's College, which is not the same as St. John's University, thankfully. But the future of conservatism, I mean, we could try to predict what it's going to be. We could try to talk about what it's going to be. I think in broad strokes, my prediction and my hope are the same, which is to say that the future of conservatism will be cultural conservatism. We'll be continuing to fight the culture war, and it will be populist. The question is, what culture war are we going to fight, and what kind of populist conservative is it going to be? So we get a good dichotomy in what sort of culture wars you could fight by looking at CPAC. That's a Conservative Political Action Conference that I started covering back in 2000, and I have attended and spoken a lot. This year at CPAC, there were 0 panels on abortion. There were 0 panels on issues involving transgender ideology. There were 0 panels on religious liberty vis-a-vis questions of marriage, contraception coverage, abortion, that sort of thing. There were plenty of panels on owning the libs. So those are the 2 different sort of culture wars we can fight. Are we going to fight a culture war that is standing up for what is tried and true for family, faith, community? Or are we going to fight a culture war where we're standing up for the latest loudmouth podcaster who got canceled, or for the latest reality TV star who cheated on his wife with a porn star and used his campaign funds to pay her hush money? What sort of culture war are we going to fight? The problem is that the incentives in the conservative movement are for the stupid, fighting the stupid culture war. Why? Because defending faith, family, community doesn't really pay. Well, getting people pissed off really does. So I've been in the conservative movement and near it for more than 20 years. And the more recent word that gets used sometimes is grift. The older grift when I was in Washington was true believers in the pro-life cause, in faith, family, and community being exploited by people who were just trying to turn the conservative movement into the lobbyists for big business. That still exists. But the newer grift is people who are monetizing eyeballs and anger and outrage over things that really don't matter. And so we need to make sure that the culture war we're fighting is the right culture war. And what sort of populism do we want? Well, the populism that I mean, in 2012, I was saying Mitt Romney attacking the 47% who don't pay income taxes is totally wrong. We need to make sure that working class people become Republicans. We need a Republican Party that taps into that working class. And then we sort of got that like mainlined into our veins in 2016, and I was caught off guard by that. The populism we need is a populism that says about 10% of what Elizabeth Warren says is right, and her solutions are 110% wrong, because big government is a home game for the special interests, for the big businesses who can hire the lobbyists and afford to deal with all the costly regulations. Why did Philip Morris lobby for more regulation of tobacco? Why did Mattel and Hasbro lobby for more regulation of toys? Why is Uber lobbying for more regulation of gig workers? Because they can afford to deal with it, and then they're going to hire the guy who wrote the regulation as their own lawyer to fix it. So the populism that we can offer is not a populism that offers the same sort of state-managed corporatism that the left is offering today and that the right of the George Bush era offered. But because guess what? That's trying to use the ring of power for good. When you empower the state to pick winners and losers, what's going to happen is your winners are not going to get picked. The people with the best lobbyists are going to get picked, and you will further entrench corporate America, the very same corporate America that is undermining our culture wars. So I want to get to discussions as quickly as possible, so I'm going to come back to that idea of the Lord of the Rings and the ring of power and government power vis-a-vis the culture wars. There's a right place to fight the culture wars too, and a wrong place. The best place, we saw it this last fall, the Loudoun County Board of Education. The place to fight the culture wars is where the decisions are made. It's where it's as local as possible. The bigger fight to have is to devolve the power back down to being made as a local decision as possible. So then you can go to your school board and fight to get rid of the drag queen story hours in your own school board. The wrong place to fight it, first of all, is Fox News and these other places that don't do anything except get outrage clicks. The other wrong place to fight it is, in a lot of these fights, going to be Congress. Then there's some issues that are proper to fight on the state level. Abortion needs to be passed on the state level, and some laws need to be passed on the federal level. But maybe micromanaging our curriculum from the state legislatures is the wrong way to do it. And the right way to do it is make sure there's no bad laws on the state level. You go down to the powers on the local level, and that's where you fight, where you really have your feet planted, where you've invested yourself. Because here's the fundamental conservative insight. What forms culture is not primarily government. And tradition doesn't form culture either. What forms culture is the institutions of civil society. It's the things that we belong to. It's the things that we mix our labor with. It's when you show up and you say, that book does not belong in our library. And the librarian looks at you and knows that you're the person who volunteers and runs the t-ball team, and you're the person, and your wife is a person who volunteers for the hot lunch on Fridays. And when you're saying this book doesn't belong in our library, they know that you're coming from a place of good faith, rather than a state legislator showing up and trying to do it. So we do need to fight the culture war. We do need to defend faith, family, and community. We do need to be populist and stand up for the working man. What we don't need is a central industrial policy, and we don't need us adopting the tactics of the left and trying to centralize a culture war. A centralized culture war is a culture war that the right loses. Fighting at the national level to decentralize everything, and then at the local level, go get it. That's where you impose your morality on your community, on your church, on your neighborhood, on your family. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tim. Sohrab?
Sure. So let me start by thanking the Ryan Center for hosting this debate, and also, just like Tim, thanking all of you for coming here despite all the other Villanova events competing for your time. It's also my first time at Villanova, so very pleased to be here. Has anyone here seen The Shining? I think most people have. Stanley Kubrick, I mean the Stanley Kubrick version. Good, because that classic horror movie provides a great image for what much of the conservative movement is today. The movement is like the woman in room 237. She's beautiful and seductive at first, but in fact, when you approach her, she's like this hideous, decomposing corpse, ooze draining from her body, and she menaces you. And so the beautiful surface, if I may use this analogy, the beautiful surface is the lofty ideals deployed by much of the establishment conservative movement: liberty, family, enterprise, community, etc. The hideous corpse is an ideological apparatus that's mainly designed to uphold a system of private tyranny ruled by a corporate overclass that menaces that all the conservatives claim to cherish. This is true of all three of the stools of the classic conservative fusion. As you know, there's a theory of conservatism, and I think it's correct, that conservatism is founded on three stools. And I believe this theory that I put forward, the shining theory of the conservative movement, is true of each of them individually to various degrees, and especially when they operate together as a whole. The three stools, just to make sure everyone knows, are the business conservatives or business libertarians. Conservatives is a really wrong word to use about them. Foreign policy hawks or national security hawks, and social conservatives and traditionalists. Now, these three were thrown together just by an accident of history. There was no eternal law that demanded that these three camps pull together. It just was that there was a Cold War on, and the communist threat sufficed to bring them all into one camp, because each of them represented different social classes that felt equally threatened by Soviet communism, and rightly so. And so it was an accident of history that brought them together. The fact that they don't need to all be working in tandem together is proved by the fact that especially after 2016, with the rise of the Trump event and of populism across the developed world, really, Trump, Brexit, rise of social, populist conservatives across the developed world, shattered that alliance so that you had the three groups at each other's throats across different lines of alliance and enmity. So that fusion is dead. I think a lot of people would tell you today that that fusion, there's something broken about it. There is still a profound kind of folk libertarianism, which I support, by the way. There's much that's healthy about it in the GOP base. But the folk libertarian is not in the same place as the kind of pro-corporate libertarianism that comes from Washington, D.C. think tanks and magazines, because the people who espouse that kind of folk libertarianism find themselves on the sharp end of big tech censorship. They don't favor open borders the way the Chamber of Commerce does, so they're in tension together. The hawks and libertarians are at each other's throats in some ways because the hawks, at least when it comes to security, favor really big government, really a surveillance state. The hawks are also indifferent at best, to the social conservatives. And then there is this emerging fourth camp of what I would call unchurched populists who don't quite fit into any of the three camps. So the whole fusion is very much flawed, but again, I would say that all three of those groups have failed on their own terms, and that's really the shining metaphor. So the neocons promised freedom, but they really wrought 2 decades of instability in the Middle East, shattering existing states, all again in the name of freedom, and all along the domestic hearth crumbled. The social conservatives preach family, community, etc., but they don't pay attention to the material base, the material foundation that sustains family, that sustains community. If you have a society in which corporate forces constantly create dislocation, constantly create instability in workers' ability to access healthcare, access sufficient wages, and so forth, you're not going to have the things that social conservatives claim to preach for. And then there's obviously the libertarians. They preached liberty, but really what they're talking about is the freedom of the firm, especially of the large firm, to utterly subjugate the worker and the consumer. And it's based on this illusion of liberty as this free-floating abstract thing that is abstracted from real class dynamics, of class as a permanent reality in human societies, and a need to manage those to have an equitable relationship between classes. The liberty of the libertarian ignores this, and what it ends up being is the liberty, is really the liberty of the large firm and the bondage of the worker, of the American worker especially. So all of the sort of things that typically conservatives complain about are things that conservatives themselves have brought about, right? In other words, the things that the center-right in this country spends a lot of time right now griping about are products of conservative policies that they have to own. And I'm going to go through, and I'm going to talk about them in the context of a couple of prominent DC think tanks. But to discuss that, I'm just giving you a microcosm. I could expand beyond those, but just to give you a couple of examples. So to start with big tech censorship. A long time ago, a lot of both conservatives and, let's say, non-woke progressives warned that the architecture created under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act would allow these social media companies to act as publishers, censoring certain views while allowing or encouraging others. In other words, allowing them to have an editorial voice without having any of the publisher's responsibility that I would have, that Emil would have at the American Conservative. And what was the response of the mainstream conservative movement at the time? Only recently has Heritage Foundation begun to sound a different note. As recently as 2019, 2020, they were publishing papers, basically white papers saying, look, the best we can do is just let the market regulate it. Now, this is after the fact where not only prominent conservatives have been removed by Silicon Valley fiat off the internet, but President of the United States has as well. All we can do is just have market solutions. Now, Heritage has changed its tone. I would say AEI probably hasn't nearly as much, but it's a little bit too late, right? Because Heritage at the time, not that much, but nevertheless, you have to take into the fact that they were getting money from big tech. They were getting money from Google. Okay, the opioid crisis. This is an interesting one. In the American Enterprise Institute, in October 2004, one of its scholars published a New York Times essay, quote, claiming, quote, when you scratch the surface of someone who's addicted to painkillers, you find a serial drug abuser with a previous habit involving pills, alcohol, heroin, cocaine, etc. And contrary to media portrayals, the typical OxyContin addict does not start as a pain patient who then falls into the habit. Now, we absolutely know that that's not true now, which is why Purdue Pharmaceutical, the manufacturer of OxyContin, has settled and is basically that the whole family has been utterly disgraced because of the effects of the drug and how incredibly addictive it is. What that New York Times article didn't mention is that the AEI had received at that point $800,000 from Purdue Pharmaceutical. And a month before, the author of that article, Sally Satel, who's a scholar at AEI, still is, I believe, sent the article to Purdue Pharmaceutical's DC lobbyist, a guy named Rosen, to get his feedback. And then a month later, when the article actually appeared in the Times, the vice president of whatever corporate relations at AEI then sent it to Rosen again, saying, did you see Sally's piece? To which Rosen replied, we know all this through Purdue litigation, to which Rosen replied, quote unquote, great piece. In none of those cases did the New York Times article and then many other articles, including the New York Post, where I was the opinion editor, and the Wall Street Journal, where I used to work as an opinion editor, did they disclose that AEI and Sally Satel had been receiving funding from Purdue Pharmaceutical. This is the world, this is the material world of conservatism. If you peer behind all the rhetoric of family and so forth, this is the material reality that lurks behind that facade of official establishment conservatism. Someone else was at AEI at the time, and that's Scott Gottlieb, who was a fellow and then went and became the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration and now is back at AEI. When he was at FDA, obviously, he would have overseen drug approvals. And recently, Scott tweeted something basically urging Utah's governor to put a stop to a law that would have prevented from children from being trans, and then ultimately at sports competitions involving biological males. Now, keep in mind, Scott is also on the board of Pfizer and receives $350,000 a year for that role. And Pfizer is one of the main manufacturers of the kind of hormone injections, hormone replacement injections involved in the trans process. Now, whatever you think about the trans question, on its own terms, the conservative movement says that that it's not good, right? That we don't want biological male athletes competing with female ones. And that there's something real about man and woman, male and female, that can't be overridden by pharmaceutical products. But here you have, and then the whole AEI team sort of went and defended him when he came under fire for this statement. So what does that tell you? It tells you that there is a material reality driving our cultural crises, and the attempt of conservatives to treat culture as this autonomous thing that is separate from ownership relations in society, class relations in society, and ultimately corporate power is a mistake, and it's a pernicious mistake, as you can see in these two cases. So what do we do with conservatism? I would say the conservative movement today needs to go back and build alliances with folk libertarians that were really against the surveillance state, against the permanent war state, and also old school progressives, old school, not woke progressives of today, but old school progressives who were warning about excessive corporate power in this country. And if you build that alliance, you can be very powerful electorally, and it would also be the right thing to do for the country. But as for the old conservatism, treat it like, Jack's son and wife did in The Shining. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks very much, Sohrab. Now we'll turn things over to Bill Allen.
Am I turned on? Yes, thank you. Forgive me if I stand. It's just a matter of habit. Thank you for the invitation. Both to the Lions Center and to the American Conservative. Thank all of you for coming out. It's indeed a pleasure to join with you. I will confess to you at the outset that I wasn't quite certain what it was that the topic, the future of American conservatism, meant. I'll explain why momentarily. But let me say to begin with that I certainly recognize the echoes of conservative sentiment, not only in what we have heard, but in the associations that are now revealed to me. I'm quite sure that when Mr. Carney was studying at St. John's University, I was in the middle of my 2-decade service on the board of directors, providing him an education. I don't doubt that as to the founding of the American Conservative by my friend-in-law, Pat Buchanan, I say friend-in-law because his sister Bays was and remains very dear to me. Not that I was intimate with Pat, but nevertheless, very much keenly aware of what Pat's mission was. Often disagreed with Pat, I must say, for reasons which I hope to make clear. But as it now strikes me that all of these associations going back so very long, and I hate to dwell nostalgically on the past, but I've been plying these waters since I was a youth, and they look very different to me now than they did then. And so I just want to spend a few minutes trying to explain to you why they look different to me now than they did when I trooped through the streets for Barry Goldwater and spent a few months as an apostle of Ayn Rand and engaged in a few other, not altogether wholly to be praised activities during my youthful activism, but my very principled and sincere concern with conservatism. In those days, conservatism did not mean partisanship to me. There were political parties. They were Democrat and Republican. And the reason I was conservative was because neither fully expressed the depth of principled commitment that I experienced. I haven't seen that change since. But I have seen the conversation about conservatism tend to become increasingly cornered in the attempt to identify in a partisan way. Where are our allies? What is our political agenda? The idea that conservatism has a political agenda is therefore foreign to me. I'm not quite sure I fully understand it. I will tell you that when I listen to the complaints that are voiced about conservatism today, and I don't mean to offend anyone by saying this, what I hear sounds to me a lot like the complaints of slaves who don't quite know how to get their freedom. And I wonder how we ever got into this posture, where what we're doing is shouting against the world, "You are repressing me, and I want you to stop," rather than exerting ourselves to liberate ourselves. That's a strange kind of conservatism. It's almost a quiescent conservatism, a conservatism that looks for the angle rather than responds to the moment. If you ask me about the future of American conservatism, I would say if all it can do is look for the angle, it is doomed. It has already lost its way. There is no hope for it. Oh, yes, it can be more or less effective in seeking partisan alignments and seeking a little bit more in the way of either populist emphasis or a little bit more in the way of deregulatory emphasis or a little bit more in the way of some other policy prescription. But I don't know what that has to do with anything that can properly be called conservatism. I'll illustrate for you because illustrations are always more powerful than elaborate rationalizations or reasonings. Imagine you were, let's say, Harry S. Truman. That's a good imagining, isn't it? You were born at the very end of the 19th century, and there you beheld the emergence of the internal combustion engine, just discovered, promising great changes for the future. And you, the youthful Harry, would look up to the adults who were in charge of deciding your future, and you found them contemplating let's kill all the horses so we can speed up the production of the internal combustion engine. If that were you, that young Harry S. Truman, you wouldn't have gotten to drive that first Model T so soon as you did. For the productive processes that enable the new era of mechanization to come into existence required the backbone of a horse. In other words, if you hadn't transitioned and used the resources you had to produce the new future, you would not have arrived there. Now, it shouldn't be hard to apply that simile. We are in the hands of policymakers today who say, let us kill the internal combustion engine to bring about a new battery-propelled universe, who don't recognize that smooth transition is the only way to determine the efficacy of new invention. They say now we need to have an all-electric home, as if it were the first time that it had ever been expressed, when those old enough remember that that was also the dream in the 1950s, when nuclear power loomed on the horizon as the end of fossil fuel, the opening of a dream of a smoothly belured existence, fully propelled quietly and without polluting effect. And of course, we made a stab in that direction toward that transition, but we all know how that turned out. Nuclear power didn't deliver the promise of all electric industrial production that we thought it would in the 1950s. Wisely, we didn't kill the internal combustion engine and fossil fuel, thinking we'll grab the nuclear power so we can cast that aside. We opted for a smooth transition. It turned out the nuclear power didn't serve, so that transition didn't happen as had been envisioned. In other words, it was a hunch, not a certainty. The internal combustion engine was a hunch until it was proved effective. The Green New World is a hunch until a smooth transition establishes as effective. What am I saying to you? I'm saying to be conservative is a very simple formulation. Keep what you have that is of value until you have a demonstrated replacement for it. And nothing else is conservative. Keep what you have that is of value. That is conservative. Nothing else is. No one's peculiar agenda, no one's preferred policy alternative is, by definition, conservative. Oh, it may be a wonderful idea. It may well be worth embracing. It may be the appropriate agenda for a partisan political effort, or even just well-intentioned citizens. But there's nothing conservative about it. The difference between being a conservative and being a radical is acting on the basis of smooth transition versus acting on the basis of a radical hunch. Gambling on a hunch. That's it. That's the whole story. But we have been developing a mythology of American conservatism that began in the 1940s with Burnham and grew with Buckley. And yes, there was a powerful political social movement that wrapped the name about itself, as we like to say today, branded itself. But you notice, when you talk about branding, you're not talking about ideas. You're talking about images, vague promises, ineffable commitments, nothing very concrete. Conservatism is, if anything, very concrete. It it begins with the recognition, first of all, that we are here. We're not somewhere else. We're here. And it says we know who we are. We're not in doubt about who we are. And therefore, we know what is of value. And we are then free to resolve to preserve it. That is the language of conservatism. It is not a language that says we're going to change the world, but it is a language that says we are prepared to manage the world's change. A slight difference. I hope you hear it. For no conservative denies that the world is going to change. The question is, how does change come? The conservative is prepared to manage the change, to effectuate smooth transitions, to accommodate human necessities to the circumstances, and always to resist waging everything on a hunch. What is the future of American conservatism? Doomed, unless it can understand that that is its essential character.
All right, well, thank you very much for that, Bill. And now I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to...
I'll pipe in first. My slight, not a modification, but a slightly different way of phrasing conservatism is we understand that rapid, dramatic changes to complex systems are likely to do massive amounts of harm, and at times and often that harm exceeds whatever good that they do. And so rapid, dramatic changes to complex systems is not evolution of ideas or culture or society, but things that are introduced often by ideologues or by people who are world improvers who really try to do it. And that's why we sort of, the imprecise but beloved way National Review described its mission was standing athwart history crying halt. You're saying not a halt, but whoa, hold on. Let's take this slowly. Let's think about what we're doing here. And so I would agree with that, and that's why the state, a powerful state always has to be terrifying to conservatives, because a powerful state, as a matter of fact, has the ability to bring about rapid changes to complex systems. And that's what so much of the sexual revolution and the culture wars of the last few years has been. It's also a reason to fear massive corporations, because the centralization of any sort of power has to worry. I think Sohrab mischaracterizes both libertarians and my employer, the American Enterprise Institute. First of all, most libertarians are not corporatists. Most libertarians are not pro-corporate. Most of them, the most famous libertarian healthcare scholar, Cato Institute, Michael Cannon, he's constantly on the other side. As professionally, he's an opponent of the health insurance industry, the hospitals, and half the time, the drug industry. So libertarians were the ones who opposed the bailouts. Libertarians were the ones who opposed they're my allies in fighting against all the corporate welfare that I talk about. Is there lots of capture of people in Washington, D.C. in these movements by industry? Yes. American Enterprise Institute, where I work, first of all, they employed me in 2012 specifically to attack corporate welfare. This is why they hired me. I wrote 2 books about corporate welfare, about corporatism. Boeing, a giant of the military-industrial complex, is one of my top targets, and GE is another. I have no idea who the corporate donors are. I learned from good journalism, like the people who dug up the stuff on the opioid stuff, and I'll let Sally Satel and Scott Gottlieb defend themselves. But AEI also takes no institutional positions. So whatever Sally or Scott's position is not an AEI position. But finally, where Sohrab and I would agree for sure is that libertarians wrongly elevate liberty to a good in itself, an ultimate good. It's an intermediate good. But I'm going to distinguish quickly between intermediate goods. This is Lent. We Catholics give up things that are good, but unnecessary. Chocolate, beer, whiskey. I guess two of those three are kind of the same, but you know what I mean. We give up intermediate goods. We give up dispensable goods. Freedom is not a good thing in itself. Free will is not a good thing in itself, right? Free will is often a path that we follow to sin and to damnation. Freedom is often a path and a license to bad things. But they're not like chocolate and booze in that they are absolutely essential. The only way to get to our supernatural goal, which is love of God, is through free will, and that is why God gave us free will. The only way to get to our worldly goal, which is a life of virtue and loving others, is through freedom. So freedom is indispensable. And the flip side of that is that centralizing power in corporations or in government is inherently destructive of freedom. This is why we fear Facebook's power, but this is why redoing Section 230 to allow the government to meddle with how Facebook censors or allows content is even more dangerous. I'd rather have to apply pressure to Mark Zuckerberg than to worry about what Kamala is going to decide is not allowed to be on the internet. So this is why conservatism can't be an ideology, because it's always got to be weighing these different things. What is most likely to provide a harmful, rapid, destructive change to a complex system, which is our culture?
Sure. A few thoughts. One, again, I appreciate Tim's work, and I've known him for a long time. But I thought it was worthwhile to point out, and it's, by the way, it's not just AEI. It's a whole world of center-right and center-left establishment think tanks have been operating this way for a long time. That's the most kind of naked form, where a scholar publishes something but doesn't disclose that of the firm that manufactures the product she's defending is paying the think tank where she works, and also is in touch, their lobbyists are in touch with the leadership of the think tank and are kind of approving the pieces after the fact. It goes beyond the normal version, but it's a kind of extreme case. But there's a larger world that's like this. And I think this question of how do you manage change, or how do you avoid drastic change, has to take into account what of the current state that we try to conserve is itself a product of revolutionary changes, right? In other words, what did the rise of industrial capitalism, and then its most, in the 19th century, intense, violent class warfare in this country that gets settled somewhere around after World War II, with the New Deal and then rise of unionism. You have this kind of tripartite way to settle these changes and differences that are coming, so that labor, capital, and government sit at a table and decide things, and you have a period of intense middle-class prosperity. That was the norm in the 50s and 60s. I would argue in the 70s it began to crumble, and then especially in the 80s with the neoliberal and Reaganite attack on those achievements. So when conservatives talk about managing change and resisting dramatic changes, at what point do you draw the line of, okay, here's the pristine state of things that we want to preserve? Is it the brutal, violent class warfare of the late 19th century and into the early 20th century? Is it that period of settlement between labor, capital, and government, with the church providing a kind of morally guiding role? Or is it now the neoliberal state of things, which has been going on, let's say, since the 70s, which has seen capital make enormous gains at the expense of consumers and workers? is that the settlement? Is it, because it's certainly not eternal, that came about as a result of certain laws, and as a result, in other words, the state weighed in to create these current conditions. Let me give you an example. Two parallel examples. One takes place in Canada, one takes place in the United States. Here's the Canadian version. An Uber driver named Heller gets into a dispute with Uber Technologies. And the Uber contract says, well, if you have a dispute over wages, et cetera, you have to go to a commercial arbitration. It takes place in Amsterdam or something like that, or Geneva, and it costs 15,000 euros for your case to even be heard. Now, let's say you hire Dutch or Swiss counsel and prevail in that forum, you still have to then retain Canadian counsel to enforce the judgment of the arbitration court. The Canadian court said, no, that's unconscionable. And by the way, you're withholding common law rights that the employee has otherwise under their contract or under Canadian statutory law by forcing them into this kind of arbitration. Okay? That's the Canadian Supreme Court. What did the conservatives on our Supreme Court do? Similar case. It's called Lewis versus Epic System, 2018. The Obama administration was on the side of the employee in this case. When the Trump administration came in, they switched sides. What did happen in that case? Again, it's a dispute between employee and employers, but in this case, the employer sends an email at like 5 o'clock in the afternoon saying, if you show up to work tomorrow, you effectively accede to commercial arbitration as a way to resolve our disputes. Thank you very much, And our courts, including our conservatives on the Supreme Court and the Trump administration, said, right, that's right. Because we want to encourage arbitration. Now, these cases are each maybe worth $1,200, $1,500. So there's no economic way for you to be able to rationally prosecute them in arbitration in Geneva or wherever, right? Is that a normal state of things that conservatives should preserve, or is that the product of legal revolutions that themselves happened 40 years ago? And you might want to think, well, maybe we should go earlier and say, well, was there an earlier state of things that was more just or more equitable? So when we talk about radicalism versus conservatism, we have to be careful. Maybe the order that you're preserving is itself a product of radical change, brought about relatively recently, which we then reify and turn into permanent realities, where in fact they're a product of contingent class conflicts and balance of forces, and one side won, but you can have a more just settlement if you think about it otherwise.
Let me make a couple of observations. I'll start with Mr. Ahmari, who I think is incorrect in his assessment of the circumstances regarding what he calls a pristine state to preserve in interpreting the difference between drastic change and managing change. The meaning of managing change does not mean preserving a pristine state of change. It means precisely accomplishing change. So here we have a terminological difficulty. But the terminological difficulty is not the only difficulty. He's in that position because he fails to understand that he has reified the distinctions between conservative and radical, rather than seeing the process as a process unfolding. So he says, for example, you have this contractual relationship which is imposed positively, imposed by law. He didn't use those words, but that's what he meant. Well, the law he's talking about is the law of the Constitution, which says the obligations of contract shall not be imparted. So that when the court says, we will abide by the law of the Constitution, which means you, as an individual citizen, must be held responsible to know what you're doing. Mr. Ahmari says, no individual citizen should be responsible to know what he's doing. He should be protected by law, positively. And all possible relationships should be governed by positive law. And we should therefore strike the balance of positive laws in a way to facilitate a humane resolution. In other words, he wants a constructivist state through and through. And he calls that a form of conservatism. It is an unusual argument, one that I've never heard before in behalf of conservatism. And it's unrelated to a problem I discern in my friend Mr. Carney's comments. For he talks about conservatives and libertarians and leads me to wonder what he thinks the difference is between a conservative and a citizen. For the things he says about conservatives, what they ought to do, what their attitudes ought to be, strike me to be what he ought to be saying about citizens and the responsibilities and obligations of citizenship. So why has this displacement taken place? Why do we assign to ideological positionings what we can readily understand in terms of the general obligations of citizenship? When George Washington says in 1783 that the motive that induced me to take to the field of battle was civil and religious liberty, he didn't say conservative liberty, conservative rights. He said civil and religious liberty. That is what he identified as worth defending, worth preserving. Not a pristine state of things, but a condition for all things. The circumstances in which all things should take place. So what are we missing? We're missing a comprehensive understanding that makes clear to us what the fundamental conditions for all things, all policy discussions, all legal decisions ought to be. And there cannot be an articulation of a conservative principle that fails to do that.
Well, Tim or Sohrab, if you'd like to respond to that, I can give you a minute or two, and then we could open things up for questions from the audience.
It's just a very technical point that commercial arbitration is a relatively recent invention, and there's lots of common law mechanisms that you could see overriding a person signing on a piece of contract an agreement to go into commercial arbitration. There's also statutory ones where, like, for example, XYZ labor statute says you have XYZ rights to vindicate your case in a regular court, in a regular sort of Article 3 court, and it comes into conflict with the provision of your employment contract that shoots it over to commercial arbitration. And so it's not obvious that commercial arbitration is sort of enshrined forever in the Constitution, is because it's a relatively recent thing. It's not that kind of an issue.
With all due respect, that's a misstatement. The argument is not that commercial arbitration is enshrined in the Constitution. It is the Constitution says the obligations of contract shall not be imparted. So the question becomes whether in any particular case of arbitration, it is read by the court as an obligation of contract. It applies not only in commercial cases, it applies in cases that sometimes affect even things like divorce and other kinds of relationships.
So under our system,
hold on. These evolved practices of arbitration are questionable. I'm not denying that you can find plenty of reason to disagree with them. But to think that they are merely the expression of positive law that are being interpreted as positive laws by the court without further background is a mistake. That is not correct.
I disagree, but I don't want to carry it on.
Tim, care to respond?
I'll take as a friendly amendment that the things I said were the work of a conservative is the work of a citizen.
Okay, thank you. So we have just over half an hour remaining, so I'd like to open things up to Q&A from the audience. What I'm going to do, we are live streaming, so what I'd like to do for their benefit, the people who are listening at home, is pass the microphone to people who are going to ask a question. So I'll actually get up and bring the microphone to you. All right? First.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks for the microphone, obviously. My question would probably be primarily for Dr. Allen. You mentioned the difference between a conservative and a radical. And I think possibly close to what Mr. Ahmari was saying was something on the line of a, quote, counter-revolutionary. Of what would you say the solution is for a conservative if they believe, or in reality there is an effect of rapid destructive changes that have happened, not only in, say, the corporate arbitration sphere, but in social politics, gender relations, race relations, et cetera, where very rapid and destructive radical ideas have happened, what are conservatives to do to amend that rather than only a focus on sort of managed change towards a better future, if that makes any sense?
It makes altogether perfect sense, and I will begin by saying that you cannot always amend it. And therefore, the obligations of citizenship, and indeed the obligations of humanity, must go beyond that. So rather than circumscribing ourselves within the universe of positive law, we must ask, are there transcendent obligations we have? When the law fails us, where do we turn? So these are questions not only of citizenship, but questions of piety as well. Your obligation is to stand for the truth and to stand even after you have not succeeded. That means to stand in the face of peril. And that means to argue persuasively. And failing to persuade, it means to make hard decisions, including decisions about whether you can live in such a society. Those are the principles that you stand for. And you don't stand on the proposition that there is some trick, which if you just apply it properly will make everything work to your satisfaction. So the first thing you learn as a conservative is to deal with a world in which things may not work to your satisfaction, in which you must make decisions about how to respond to them.
And I'll add to that, because I referred to some state legislative things that I don't like. I don't know the details about the Utah law, but I have seen conservative legislators they see a bad thing, especially you got some liberal school district doing something bad. And they say, I must stamp out that bad thing, and we have the power to legislate, and so let's do it. And I mean, so to start again with my colleague and friend Scott Gottlieb, he's not a social conservative, he's a social moderate, but you could make the argument, this bad thing is happening, and any effort from this position to stop that bad thing halfway across the country, halfway across the state from happening, might do more harm than good. So what is my obligation? All of us are blessed with a public microphone, so our obligation is to stand up and tell the truth. Not always to even persuade, but to the person sitting there. I had an old boss said, there's someone in St. Louis who's watching MSNBC, this is before MSNBC was what it is now, and thinking, am I the crazy one? And you have to say, no, you're not the crazy one. You think masks make it harder to be neighborly? You're right, you're not the crazy one. You think men are men, women are women, boys are boys, girls are girls. You are not the crazy one. So sometimes it's simply telling the truth, not even trying to persuade, and then realizing I may have this weapon in my hand, but it is not fit for the task at hand. And I think too many times conservatives these days, especially state legislators and sometimes congressmen, think, oh, well, I have the power to legislate. I'm going to fix this problem. It might just be up to the people who show up at the school board meeting in that particular town to try to fix a problem. And then, if we're obviously not the majority in Austin, Texas, it might just be our responsibility to say, well, I guess I got to pull my kids out of Austin, Texas public schools and go to the next town.
Let me just add
Yeah, I mean,
quickly.
this is a typical thing where it doesn't take into account this kind of worldview, this kind of conservative idealism, actually, I would say, is actually profoundly unrealistic. So, for example, the idea, just to go back very briefly to the commercial arbitration case, the idea is that there's a free labor market. You can just, if you didn't like that contract. But remember, the employee showed up, took a job, and then the employer amended the contract on the spot. If you show up tomorrow, you're now subject. That is not a freely contracted to thing, right? Or in this case, well, if it doesn't work out, I will have to educate my kids at home or send them to another school district. That may be not possible for a lot of working class people, a lot of middle class people, and yet they should go to schools in which men and women are legible, immutable categories that are protected. And so in this case, I mean, it's clear. I mean, the Utah case is just saying biological men with all of the kind of muscular mass that they have, the stamina that they have, should not compete with girls because they win. Look at Leah Thomas, the UPenn, my wife went to UPenn, but look at Leah Thomas, utterly dominating every record of women. How is that fair? Of course the state has a role in defining basic truths when they intrude upon justice, basic justice of what happens in the swimming pool or and yet AEI, Pfizer, with a board member of Pfizer, who's also a senior fellow at AEI, says, well, we should be, no, I hope the governor blocks this because this is about kids' emotions and so on and so forth. No, it's about the truth. It's about the truth. And is the American Enterprise Institute, one of our premier conservative institutions, can say that the state has a role when you have utterly powerful, well-muscled men like Leah Thomas dominating girls' sports, and say, yeah, that's not right. I don't understand this thing of, well, you go to your local school board, and if not, you homeschool or change it. No, this is eminent, and it's not a question of subsidiarity, and I think we shouldn't misuse subsidiarity. If a problem can't be solved at the smallest level, then of course the higher authority has a responsibility.
I'm gonna.
Let me just say
Who are you
before you
rooting
go
for
on.
in Ukraine?
Let me just say before you go on.
That's
I
completely
think
irrelevant.
this is the very example of the
Ukraine.
slave mentality that I was talking about. You cannot defend yourself. The state must defend you. That is really a fateful step to take because it means you've sacrificed everything. We are ciphers, not citizens, on that reading. The fact of the matter is, you don't need to pass legislation to ban, what do you call them, men competing as women, to still leave people free to refuse to participate. There are many ways in which people can respond to that without calling on the state to produce fairness. If we don't recognize the capacity of individuals to defend their fundamental rights, then we have no particular basis on which to stand to ask the state to defend them. But we have turned them into ciphers, which means they have no meaning, no natural meaning, no moral meaning.
I think
But what I meant to say in response to the original question was, one of the great problems and syndromes we often fall into that we have to avoid is trading opportunities to exploit the power of the state in the name of our preferred paradigms. And so that you say, the left has done it, or someone else has used regulation in such and such a way, now it's our turn. And all we end up doing is ratcheting up the power of the state, control over the citizens. That is to be avoided at all cost.
And I asked about Ukraine because we have, the United States, has the greatest military that has ever existed. And you and I are rooting for the same good guys, and you and I both believe that the United States has the power to wipe out huge amounts of Russia's invading forces. Russia is evil, doing something evil. We have the power to stop on a granular level, on a local level, what they are doing. We have missiles. We have probably tactical nukes. I admit on Twitter the other day, I don't even know what that means, but it sounds really good, right? Let's blow up some tanks with tactical nukes. It would be imprudent to do it, even though we have the power to do it. I wrote in an anti-war piece in the very first issue of the American Conservative when it came out. I opposed the Iraq War because I knew we had the power to overthrow Saddam, but that didn't mean that government action in this case was the right thing. That's a conservatism. My anti-warness has never been libertarian. Even when I thought it was always conservative. It's that using the Ring of Sauron was not going to turn out well for the good guys. And that's what you're doing. I mean, again, subsidiarity doesn't mean everything's done at the local level. You're absolutely right. It means there's a proper level for everything. And in a lot of these culture war cases, the proper level is going to be where the Loudoun County parents fought it out, which was in their school board.
So if you oppose going to World War III and inviting nuclear Armageddon, you should also oppose, a law that says that a male shouldn't compete with girls. I don't get it. I don't get the analogy.
I'm saying that conservatism calls for, at times, not using a weapon that's at hand to directly address a threat, but occasionally, sadly, tolerating evil, knowing that some attempts to defeat that evil will bring about a greater evil.
Okay, I went to a second-tier law school, but that analogy doesn't work for me.
I'm going to cut in. Thank you, gentlemen, for the very lively answer. I've been standing for quite a while, so I'm going to hand off the microphone finally.
All right, thanks. All right, we got another question here.
Yes. Hello. Going back to the contract talk, couldn't you say it's a hallmark of American jurisprudence to eschew morality and sort of embrace law and economics? I'm thinking of the Oliver Wendell Holmes quote, where he said when a man signs a contract, he agrees to either do it or pay for the remedies of the breach. And I know Harold Berman said that when particularly pious law students got to law school, they couldn't grasp that because they view it as a breaching of an oath. You're not supposed to do that, simply.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would refer you to the case Buck v. Bell. Do you know that case? Okay. It's also a case decided by your favorite jurist in which he said, it's okay to sterilize a mentally incapacitated woman so that she doesn't have any more children because 3 generations of idiots are enough. Or something like that. That's so famous. So no, the American law is never been, although there have been attempts, is never nearly as ruthlessly positivist as you suggest. We've always had various restrictions on the right to contract. I mean, you can go down with it's against policy, it's against conscience, and so on and so forth, where common law courts have said that that's, even though someone has signed some piece of paper, it doesn't mean that the state should bind them, but it should bind them to that contract because it offends morality. And there's all sorts of other laws that we have which wouldn't make sense, which wouldn't be legible as law unless read against this moral and kind of ethical frame. So no, I mean, that's not the case. Although there are psychopathic statements in American law, like Justice Holmes is in that case. Yeah.
And on the other hand, we could say yes. We could say yes because the Buck v. Bell decision has nothing to do with the decision which you quoted. The fact that Holmes could be stupid in one case doesn't mean he's not intelligent in another. And so that's a non sequitur. It is also the case, as we go back to the whole problem of obligations of contract, the employment situation is typically at will, which means that the employee who received a notice that if he shows up tomorrow he has an additional obligation could just as well have received a notice that he is released and been given an opportunity to return on a new contract. There is no difference between those. The only thing at stake here is the ex parte judgment that it's unfair. And it's the intrusion of this judgment ex parte of unfairness that's changing the situation and demanding that state regulatory power intrude. That's what's being defended, nothing else.
All right, so I personally have some questions, and I actually looked up on Twitter before I came here, and I had some questions about some particular takes that I saw. So two things that you retweeted, Ahmari, was one that stated the only reason why you suddenly care about Ukraine is because the media suddenly cares about Ukraine. And another thing that you retweeted was, it all seems very hollow and performative to me that the people who most passionately and, sorry, I'm going to butcher this word, vociferously were tweeting about a podcaster last week, have this week added a flag to their Twitter names, are very passionate and certain about a war they couldn't locate on a map. So, my question to you is, isn't it true that if you see someone being injured, that you will have an empathetic reaction to it in general?
Absolutely. The question is whether or not that reaction leads to prudent action or imprudent action, and whether or not that reaction is bounded by reason or unreason, or rather is unreasonable. So I've written a piece for the American Conservative, a couple of pieces, arguing that in part, the Western reaction to Ukraine has been reminiscent of other recent public hysterias, right? So that you went from having a picture of yourself with a mask in your profile picture to having one with a vaccine being injected into your arm, and now you're rooting for Ukraine, which is a country that you hadn't thought about before, let's be honest. Does that mean that your heart shouldn't flutter, shouldn't beat for people being killed because they've been invaded by a much larger and stronger adversary? Of course not. But whether or not, for example, you rush into a foolish course of action like a no-fly zone, which would almost certainly bring us into a direct confrontation with a nuclear power, that's a different question. And if that kind of hysterical reaction, oh my goodness, yes, we gotta put our mask on, stay home, stay safe, blah, 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 that kind of mimetic social media reaction gets transmuted or gets used to justify a course of action which we would all regret, namely a war with Russia, then it's a problem. And that's what I'm talking about with those retweets, but it's not just retweets. I mean, I wrote a piece about it. That, you know, like last week it was this kind of like BLM flag, this, and now Ukraine, and you're sort of lurching from one hysteria to another. Some of the underlying causes may be just, some of the underlying causes may be unjust, or maybe you don't know enough about it, or maybe you do. But either way, stop, because I've been through this as a journalist for about a decade. I've been through a number of these, and I used to be enthusiastic for them, and I've come to regret them. Maybe you will too, but I'll tell you the ones I went through. I reported, first of all, on the aftermath of the Arab Spring. In fact, on the Arab Spring. I'm from Iran. I was like, oh man, young social media savvy, smartphone wielding young Arab Democrats overthrowing kleptocrats and dictators. Oh, wonderful, look at them. Who cannot stand with them? Well, but then there were questions. If Islamists came to power, were they willing to share power with Islamists? Or if the Islamists came to power and execute them, what would we do about the Middle East and the Arab state system that we've committed to upholding? Those questions weren't asked in that moment of excitement. A few years later came the migrant crisis. I speak Persian, so I embedded with the Afghan refugees. I lived in Istanbul in a migrant safe house, and that was the next thing at the time you had to support, right? There was that kid, you remember his name? I do, Turkey. His last name was Turkey, but he was a Syrian kid who died on Turkey's western shore trying to get to Greece. He died doing that. And that was cause for Europe to completely open its doors open to any number of refugees who would come over. 1 million people came, not being vetted, many of them young men, many of them economic migrants in turn, and many of them aren't even Syrians. In fact, a lot of them weren't Syrians. They're Afghans, Iraqis, et cetera. But at that moment, if you didn't support opening Europe's gates to more than 1 million people from the Middle East and North Africa, you were a bad person. Why aren't you coming along? Then, of course, came Russiagate. That was a huge thing. The president colluded. And that was, you had to say, every week the walls were closing in on Trump, right? The walls were closing in. He's it. This is it. He's cornered. And then came the cold water of the Mueller report saying there was no collusion. Then came, of course, the COVID response. In each of these cases, if you had just gone along with the elite kind of consensus, that doesn't mean the elite consensus is always wrong. It's right about some things. But if you mindlessly went along, you would have supported bad policy outcomes, or policy outcomes we've now come to regret. Arab Spring generally was not a good result for the Middle East and North Africa. Those 1 million people destabilized Europe in many ways, led to the rise of a lot of nasty parties across Europe. COVID led to various overreactions in various ways. So that's all I'm saying, is if you're supporting Ukraine in the abstract, are you thinking about what that would mean policy-wise? Are you prepared to live with the consequences?
I agree that zealously jumping from one cause to another is going to lead to imprudence.
Let me rush quickly to agree with Mr. Ahmari. I want to take the opportunity to do that because it might otherwise sound as if I...
So sorry, my question was more about the approach to that.
Let me speak to that.
Okay.
So I think he's absolutely right to say it is important for us to resist being carried with waves of enthusiasm, particularly when those are supported by media and also publicly official propaganda outlets. And that's related to something that's very important in this general conversation and reviewing those recent events that he's described. Today was just released a report by American psychologists which said that Americans are feeling stress at a record-breaking level, near 90% in the survey, reporting being anxious and afraid. And that reflects the kind of reaction he's talking about that gets in the way of prudent response. But it is important to remember why. It is not simply that these events are happening that people are afraid. It's because fear is being cultivated, starting with the pandemic and continuing through Ukraine. We spent a month saying they're going to invade tomorrow, cultivating fear and making threats, and we're continuing. Leadership cultivates fear, and that is another sign of distinction. In earlier crises, we saw leaders cultivate confidence, not fear. And we could say those who cultivated confidence were conservative, whether it was Roosevelt or Churchill, while those who cultivate fear are not conservative and put everything at risk.
I have a open question and I guess a statement at the same time. You know, Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, you know, he's probably rolling over in his grave right about now. Because we have become, in my opinion, and I come from a very middle-of-the-road background. My father was a judge. He started off as an enlisted man in the Army and became a full bird colonel at the end. So I'm from the Reagan Democrat generation, if you will, or the tail end of that, to where in our household it wasn't about partisanship, it was more about principle. And I think the crossroads that we're at, we have I think there's a breaking point at a partisan level on both ends. You have the progressive, the new progressives, and you have the extreme, both extremes, whether it be liberal or conservative, where there's just a lack of communication. Just no, the thing that makes me, you know, I have a blog online, I personally avoid social media. So, because like social media is more of a monologue or a diatribe, or, you know, and quite honestly, we're more focused on what the Kardashians are doing rather than, I believe that Mr. Carney said it's like showing up at your local town hall and speaking your voice. So I guess this is more leading to my question for 2024. I feel that Mr. President Trump did a great job for while he was there, much like a Newt Gingrich, who did a great job while he was there, but had the sense enough to step away and keep his mouth shut. I believe that, you know, President Trump himself, his loose lips, you know, has unfortunately defined the conservative movement as being, quote unquote, wacko or misconstrued. And we both know the mainstream media still plays on that. So where do you guys hope, is there anybody hopeful for 2024?
I'll start by looking backwards. I'm better at that than looking forwards. That's part of what makes me a conservative, I guess. But I was covering elections for Bob Novak starting in 2002. And in 2004, there was this former Oklahoma congressman, Tom Coburn, running for Senate. And the whole party establishment totally opposed him. He comes in, he wins the Senate nomination, and we're like, wow, there's some sort of like revolution going on here. And then in 2010, wow, Tea Party. You know, the favorites everywhere, even Christine O'Donnell won in Delaware, and like all these people get knocked off. Arlen Specter gets driven out of the Republican Party. There's this big revolution, and the Tea Party happens. They take over the House, they make gains in the Senate, and it looks like, I had one libertarian friend who said, this is great. There's this populist uprising, and it's about economic issues because they're talking about like cutting the deficit and that sort of thing. And then 2012, Ted Cruz, boom, goes in. Like constitutional conservative knocks off the Texas Republican establishment. And we're thinking, okay, there's this free market, social conservative, pro-constitution revolution happening. Thomas Massey was one of the congressmen who came in the Tea Party wave. And he told me, he said, that's what I thought was going on. I thought this was a conservative libertarian revolution, and I was wrong. Because what 2016 showed me was they weren't voting for the libertarian, they weren't voting for the most conservative guy in the room, they were voting for the craziest son of a bitch in the room. How did that happen? Why are people willing to vote for the craziest son of a bitch in the room? That's not an indictment of the people. I don't like to indict the people, right? What are the elites doing that's causing that? A, they're totally failing. The Iraq War, the Wall Street collapse, the Wall Street bailout, et cetera. But also, Trump sort of cracked the code and realized, I thought that there was the business conservatives who were total sellouts to corporate America, and there was the pro-lifers who were all good, reading their Bible, going to Mass every Sunday, or church, or synagogue every Saturday, et cetera. And then I realized that a lot of the populist vote out there, a lot of Rick Santorum's base, for instance, were the unchurched populists. And that, so Trump just dropped all the unnecessary stuff and did what the people wanted, which was punch CNN in the face. And that is him tapping into something that no other politician was smart enough to realize. And so right now, we don't have a far right gaining power. Who do you look at when you look at the far left? It's left-wing ideologues. Who do you look at when you look at the far right? It's like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're not out there as extreme libertarians or conservatives. They're out there as extreme nut jobs. And so that lack of parallelism really dooms the Republican Party, and it especially dooms conservatism, because conservatism now means who's willing to punch CNN harder in the face. And if CNN says, you should not swallow razor blades, Marjorie Taylor Greene will go on the floor and swallow razor blades. And you can't win when your whole identity is, we're gonna own those idiots who are against us swallowing razor blades.
I will look forward. I will form the forward march of conservatives for Bernie, because I listened to a recent speech by Senator Sanders. Let me read it to you. This really resonated with me. He was talking about the state of our economy. He said, we discover that the fortunes realized by our manufacturers are no longer solely the reward of sturdy industry and enlightened foresight, but they result from discriminating favor of the government and are largely built upon undue extractions from the masses of our people. He said the gulf between employer and the employed is constantly widening, and classes are rapidly forming, one comprising the very rich, the other one the toiling poor. We discover the existence of trust combinations and monopolies, while the citizen is struggling far behind in the rear, or is trampled to death under an iron heel. Corporations, which ought to be the carefully constrained creatures of the law and the servants of the people, are becoming fast the people's masters. Actually, that wasn't Bernie Sanders, that was Republican President Grover Cleveland from 1884. So I'm with whoever is the next person in the Republican Party who can articulate a populism that isn't just eating razor blades or being mean on Twitter, although sometimes I enjoy that too, but who can be a smarter voice for this tradition that Grover Cleveland just articulated. It's the Jacksonian tradition. It's the agrarian populist tradition. It's the early progressive tradition, and then into the 20th century, it finds its voice in people like Christopher Lasch or my friend Patrick Deneen. And so if you can articulate that, but be smart about it, I'm for you. The big test right now for me is like, who is the Republican who can resist escalation over Ukraine? Because I want my kids not to, live under the shadow of nuclear war. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in part the answer to that question has to be, which is in tune with what Mr. Ahmari was just saying, who can carry the baton of reform as opposed to hitting CNN in the face or swallowing razor blades or anything else? Because that era at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was shaped by the reform candidates. Teddy Roosevelt was primarily a reformist in New York that opened the door for his ascendancy. But the question is, what are the appropriate reforms today? That's where we are stumbling. And that's where the question about what is conservatism and what is not is a meaningful question. Ronald Reagan carried a spirit of reform, even if it was boiled down to get the government out of your pocket. It was still reform. There was a tacit reform with Trump called Drain the Swamp, but you notice that one didn't have any real content to it other than the battle. So the question is, who can fill the idea of reform with content? And when you're listening to conservatives, it seems to me that's what you ought to be asking for. Tell me what reform you can spawn. Where can you lead us towards a better footing in this political community so that it becomes not just a list of grievances?
My question is, what role do you think the university has to play in the future of conservatism as we move farther away from a liberal arts tradition, more into vocational schools, more into radicalized faculties who screen new faculty for their radical viewpoints, and are requiring radicalized courses for incoming students. So an entire generation of American citizens are being formed now by people who fundamentally believe in radical change.
I think every vibrant movement needs a devil's advocate. So we can consider the university as occupying the role of screw tape for this movement.
Can I weigh in very briefly, because I know we're out of time. I love Dr. Allen's answer there, by the way. But I think we should stop talking about wokeness and what happens at American universities as all that radical. So there are two ways to look at wokeness. Is it some exotic invasion of Foucault reading, Judith Butler admiring, critical theory writing foreigners, essentially, into an otherwise liberal American tradition? Or is it a something else? Is it a legitimating ideology for the current material order, right? If you have a material order that is profoundly unequal, that is in various ways overproducing elites, and other pathologies of our actual kind of political economy, it's useful to have an ideology that transmutes the economic and material differences into discussions about how to politely talk about race, class, gender, sexuality ad infinitum, right? And so, in a way, I would argue that wokeness is not like, especially university wokeness, is some exception to the rest of America. It's producing what corporate America wants. If wokeness was some profound threat to the American establishment, right? If it really hurt their material interests, would you have in the summer of 2020, every major corporation, Nike, Apple Corp, the trustees of Ivy League universities, Brooks Brothers, for God's sake, Brooks Brothers like posted a black flag and et cetera, et cetera. If it really was a threat to their material interests, they would not do that. So it's the new kind of, this new corporate managerial ideology, right? You and I may not like it, but it is. And the universities are saying, hey, what do you want me to produce? You want me to produce this stuff? Yeah, I'm gonna do it. Here you go. Insofar as they still produce kind of humanities types, otherwise it's like science and technology, which we're not very good at in some ways. But so I always try to say to conservatives, don't say it's like the new Marxism, the commies are back. It's not. It's not. Apple is super happy with it. Brooks Brothers is happy with it. So that must serve a purpose. It's a kind of HR, human resources ideology. I'm not gonna talk, like, as Christopher Caldwell, I don't know if you know him, wonderful writer, wrote, he was writing an essay in 2017 about populism in France. And how sort of there's this urban managerial elite, owners of capital and the professionals who various ways service capital in the cores of French cities, and then you have the kind of working class that is thrown together with the immigrants in the banlieues, in the surrounding suburbs. And he was saying, this is the message of the French elite to those people. We've done nothing for the poor, but you know what? Your boss is now a transgender woman and is disabled, right? So it's like, we didn't do anything materially to improve you over the past 30, 40 years, but we gave you some kind of token change. And I think that's my general theory of wokeness.
So my closing comment on this. Conservatism isn't an ideology, and we, at the university level, we see that clearly, because the left has a clear argument to make, and Marxism, so my alma mater, St. John's College, tried to sort of say, I mean, at the University of Chicago, this great book stuff came up. It's like, what is our argument? What is our counter-argument to Marxism? I mean, Marx had a couple books, right? One of them was pretty thin, where he laid it out. We can't write that counter-argument. Ours is the Western canon, okay? We don't have a short way to rebut them, because what we have to rebut them is tradition. It's community. As you said, we know who we are and where we are. It's pointing at something and saying, this is good, and this is what they're trying to undermine. This is a Catholic school, and I'm a Catholic, and I would say, similarly, Christianity doesn't have an ideology. What are we? We point to one man, right? Like, there's something inarticulable about what we believe is the deepest good. And at the university, where you're always trying to come up with, this is our explanation, we're going to be at a disadvantage, but there are institutions, there can be institutions that can counter it, but it's going to be a lot harder than their easy sell of a nice, neat ideology that makes them feel good and protects the people in power.
Okay, thank you very much. I know there's several more questions that people would like to ask. We do have a reception afterwards, so perhaps if you didn't get a chance to ask your question during the session, you could come up to one of the speakers and ask afterwards. Just let me mention that if you're new to the Ryan Center, we do have a sign-up sheet outside where you can put your email address down and sign up to get notices about future events. And I can tell you that our next public event will be a talk by Jason Riley of the Wall Street Journal. He'll be talking on the topic of why Thomas Sowell matters, and that's on Thursday, March 31st at 4 p.m. Once again, thanks to all of you for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists for being here this evening.